Welcome back to the OPEX podcast where fitness is explained. I am your host, Robbie Burke, and I'm joined on today's show by coaching legend, Dan Pfaff. On this episode, Dan and I cover a lot of topics, including coaching mastery, why it's fundamental for coaches to have knowledge in biomechanics, biomotor abilities, bioenergetics, and biochemistry. We discuss fascia and joint hydraulics, stiffness versus compliance. We also discuss some sports medicine topics, such as return to performance protocols. I asked Dan if he's changed his mind on anything over the last few years. And finally, I asked Dan the big question. If he could invite 5 people to dinner, dead or alive, who would he invite and why? Guys, this was a brilliant episode with Dan. I know you're going to love it. Stay with us. Okay, Coach Dan Pfaff, it is an absolute pleasure and an absolute honor to have you on the OPEX podcast. I really appreciate making time, Dan. I know your time demands are massive. And you just told me before we hopped online you have done 35 flights already in 2018, which is phenomenal. So I really appreciate it. There's nobody that's going to watch this, Dan, who hasn't at least heard of your name. So what's your current role right now, Dan?
Well, I still have my hand in coaching, so I work with 2 or 3 athletes, fairly remote, where we get together at different times, different locations, but the bulk of it now is going into organizations, centers, federations, Olympic committees, and just doing an audit of sorts, what's going on, what are strengths, weaknesses, kind of a SWOT analysis for whoever brings me in. And then sit down and discuss gaps or weaknesses or strengths. We believe in keeping strengths strong, so how do they do that? But slowly fill in gaps. A lot of times, organizations come up with good action points after reviews, but there's nobody that really directs the ship, so to speak. So by default, a lot of times, a remote gatekeeper on a lot of processes, making sure the action points are addressed and followed through with.
Great stuff. So, Dan, the sort of topic I wanted to keep our interview on today is around coaching mastery. I know you are a mentor to a lot of coaches out there, track and field coaches, S&C coaches, therapists. I believe when your Altus talks, you're like, usually I wake up every day and there's already 150 or more emails waiting for me to, address questions and needs and demands. So again, this is why I appreciate you making the time for this interview. So in terms of coaching mastery, could you give maybe a sort of 30,000 square foot view of what that means to you and sort of maybe the process that goes into that?
Well, I think the foundation of coaching mastery for me is a 3-legged stool. How curious are you and how do you feed that curiosity? How compassionate are you about the people that you work with? And are you capable of empathy of everyone in the performance team and the athletes you're working with? I think part of this answer comes from experience. I know certain polemics will struggle with that comment, but as you've encountered athletes in various sporting disciplines and various sporting movements, you develop a file system to chunk information, and you develop an understanding of, is this movement aberration creating or causing an increase in chronic injury reaction? Or does it open the person? Or does the data sets or my analysis that it's inefficient compared to the best of the best at that movement quality that we're analyzing? So to me, it centers on chronicity, acuteness, and efficiency indices and measures. And if it's in violation of those 3, then I'm going to act upon it. Now, the art of coaching is, what is the rate of action upon that? And what could be a result of some other underlying feature? So you may see an aberrant arm movement, but that arm movement is reacting to ground force mechanics or support mechanics, and fixing the arm isn't going to fix the cause of the movement aberration.
Yeah.
So you have to go through the layers. One of the first tests I have is this aberrant movement being caused by some other factor or a series of factors before I address it directly, if you will.
Yeah, great stuff. You mentioned there the art of coaching. You said to me one time, Coach Tellez taught you the science and Victor Lopez taught you the art. And just with regards to coaching mastery, could you maybe just give us an overview of why both is essential?
Well, for me, science are tools of the trade. They're my paintbrushes, my canvas, the room that I work in and all of that. And then how I put things together, organize it, structure it, and create the dynamic. To me, that's more of the artistic flair of things. So when we write programming or we give feedback loops or we have interpersonal communication, to me, those are artistic leaning activities. The measurements, the dynamics of the movement, the physiology, the analysis of all of that, that's science. But even scientists have artistic flair because they have to create studies. And they have to decide which data sets to look at and to run analyses on. So to me, even the most scientific of scientists are artists in some realm.
So Dan, I know fascia is a big thing you talk about, and we're going to get into a little more of sports medicine now. So I know you often talk about joint hydraulics and how the fascial system too is very much underappreciated in sports medicine and in medicine in general. And it's funny, I was listening back to one of your talks today, and this is my thought process too, because I did neuromuscular therapy here in Ireland, and I studied under Leon Shado, Judith Delaney, practitioners who would have a very big background in fascial research and the manipulation and therapeutic protocols of fascia. So they speak a lot about James Oshman's work, which I know you're very familiar with. So can you speak maybe why fascia is so important when it comes to athletic performance, and why do you think it is just so underappreciated? Again, I think obviously there's just a lack of education, it's not within the degree programs maybe of the sports medicine practitioners. But so the question is, can you speak about the importance of fascia, and then maybe start touching into joint hydraulic systems? I love how you talk about engineering, and you say engineering has statics and fluids, and these our bodies have a certain engineering perspective to them, and yet when we look at our joints, we only ever see them through dead static perspectives. We never think about the fluid aspect. So again, joint hydraulics. So the question is fascia, its importance, why do you think it's so underappreciated, and then get into maybe knowledge of joint hydraulics within movement efficiency in terms of movement.
Well, I think a lot of it is just educational awareness in the realm of fascia. Fascia science is relatively young. As you referred to, Oshman was one of the pioneers in discussing theoretical possibilities. And then we have groups like the Steccos in Italy, Kivoyer in France, Schlepp in Germany, Myers here in North America, that are starting to expose people to, the complexity and the role and the function. I think if you've ever been in a cadaver environment and you cut through the skin and open things up, you're just overwhelmed by how much fascia is staring back at you.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. It surrounds fibrils and muscle groups and organs and vessels.
I think they just think that was fat. They're just like, geez, this person was fat. It's like, no, that's actually fascia.
No, I think a lot of surgeons still think it's junk. It's stuff that gets in the way of what they're operating on, the big rocks, so to speak, in their realm. And then the understanding of fluid dynamics within the fascial system. I think some of this is limited by technology. How do we study it? So if we take an embalmed cadaver, well, the fluid factor is almost eliminated there. So now as people are doing research on floppy cadavers that still have some fluid dynamics to it, it's changed the realm. How we stain fascial layers and how we test it and what we do to it, that's an evolving science. And it's, again, kind of controlled by our technology and our ability to use certain technologies. In terms of joint hydraulics, if we look at joint control, there's a lot of factors that play in joint control. There's muscle systems, there's tendons, ligaments, bursa, fat pad, lymphatics, vasculation, neurology, on and on and on. And all of these things operate in a symphony, if you will. So to just look at things structurally on fundamental architecture is okay. It's a starting spot. It's good to know those things. But fluid dynamics is what really pulls this symphony together and allows it to operate. Yeah. And so, I use the example, if you roll your ankle and it swells, we adapt all of our movement, stance, posture, options of movement, the variance of movement limits down, all of the negatives that come with it. Mm-hmm. That's an example of too much fluid in a joint dynamic system.
Yeah.
If we've been dehydrated, we notice coordination levels go down, range of movement is reduced, so on and so forth. That's an extreme example of not enough fluid dynamics in the hydraulic system. So I think coaches and athletes and performance people have been aware of fluid dynamics. We bang the drum for hydration and foods that have water source and so on and so forth. But I don't think we've looked at all the layers and how that affects net control in a joint or a movement system.
Great stuff. So I'm going to touch into another topic that you like to give your opinion on, and that's stiffness versus compliance. And this idea of slow versus fast converters, and this idea that came out that we need to be stiff and fast off the ground. But the question is your thoughts on stiffness and compliance and why it's not like a black or white.
I think what we're really trying to do is people are swimming in knowledge and superficial levels of knowledge, and we wanted to dig and present that there's layers to this, and then how do you apply it? How do you use it to solve puzzles? It's great to have a lot of understanding of laws of physics, but if you don't know how to apply it or use it in puzzles, then it's just, in my mind, latent knowledge that just sits there. A lot of the dynamics that we study in biomechanics, we have to dumb it down. We have to shelve it into algebraic type equations, reductionist equations, simplicity, so that we don't lose people. But the human body is a spring system filled with fluid and static engineering principles, a lot of variables going on that resist this linear reductionist approach to analyzing movement or influencing movement or even teaching movement.
Yeah.
So unless you have a firm background in differential equations or multi-level calculus, the true physics of dynamics is beyond our grasp. So I think what I've experienced and through our data sets and our research is the joint has amortization capabilities when load is put upon it. So it yields, it compresses, that puts certain structures and systems on stretch, that creates certain neurological functions like reflex, so on and so forth. So based on genetics, previous training, injuries, all of those things, all of those factors compromise this dynamic system to undergo those forces, manipulate and massage those forces, and then come up with a movement solution based on the feedback loop that it's entertaining.
Yeah.
So I think that to think that quicker on the ground, stronger on the ground is the driving answer may be a little too simplistic. I use an example. I've got 3 long jumpers over 820, and if we look at their time on the board during the takeoff moment, 3 very radically different time frames for those 3 jumpers, yet all 3 jumpers are world class. Do we massage them to try to change that impulse in a different direction? At various times of the year, we play with that, but it always seems to circle back that they have a unique time frame in which they impart impulse in order to convert horizontal into vertical. And I think Sophie Nymphus's work in Perth with changing direction is kind of leading us into that factor also. You know, how people change in directions, the depth, how long they're in an isometric moment, how much amortization of the joint system. All of those things, yeah, there's mailboxes, like it's somebody on the ground forever is not going to be very good, but somebody on the ground too short may not be maximizing their movement solution.
Yeah.
So I think that we have to look at layers, and we have to allow for bandwidth on certain dynamic principles that we arrive at through reductionist or simple maths.
When you use the term layers, could you expand on that a little bit more? Because I have an idea what you mean in terms of layers. I know you're talking like kind of all the factors that really need to go in, because I know there's sometimes you bring up this slide about like the grids that you kind of have to look through, and you're like, I know this is a lot. So you're like, there's genetic factors and epigenetic factors and psychosocial factors and previous training history, and then you always get into, we're injured from the time we come out of the vaginal canal or cesarean or whatever, and it's just like all these accumulated exposures. And I know you often speak about that too, is that, like, you know, a lot of injuries are just, they're an expression of these accumulated compensations that just have eventually reached their adaptive capacity, and some people just don't think along those lines. But could you maybe expand on what you mean by looking at layers and grids?
Well, in movement control, we just talked about all the various architectural structures that are involved. And then we had the cognitive perceptual side. How does the brain, or how does reflex loops in the spine, you know, operate and control and manipulate and massage information? So for me, layers are the simple principles. So it might be architecture, what's involved, what are the kinematics and kinetics of the movement. Then the next layer might be, okay, what are the components that control that first layer? What are the principles, the philosophy of those concepts that support that? So it's kind of a pyramid, if you will, with successive layers. The top of the pyramid is being efficient, healthy movement. And then you have the next layer, what are the constructs involved in this movement? And then the next layer would be, what are the influencers, the attractors or detractors that influence the secondary and primary objective?
Yeah, yeah, perfect. So, Dan, just going a little bit, back again a little bit to sports medicine, and you spoke about timelines, and you're like basically how redundant timelines are, because again, there's so many factors that go into how fast someone can return to play. And actually, I prefer the term return to performance. I'm not too sure where I heard that, because like return to play is just like means like, okay, you're playing, but are you back to your previous level? Like, so return to performance is probably a better term to use. But you were talking about like the sort of archaic thing of timelines, and you gave a great example of like, you know, depending on, again, genetics, epigenetics, resources, athlete compliancy, grade 2 hamstring, 14 days. He's like, someone else could be 8 weeks, 10 weeks. We don't know. So can you maybe just touch on like why timelines are an archaic way to look at return to performance?
Well, again, if we use our layer example, I think timelines are our first layer. So it's based on the epidemiology research. Generally, it takes X time post-surgery or on this type of injury or so on and so forth. So it's a first layer. It's something that should be up on the computer screen. You're checking back with it. But in my opinion, it shouldn't be the driver. Yeah, that's a little bit too absolute. So the next screen that you have open in your computer is, what are the training components that this athlete normally undergoes, and can they do them? At what level of quality of movement, forces, velocities, angles. So you have your movement map for their movement expression on all the menu items in training, or all the menu items that you analyze or look at in a game setting or in a practice scrimmage setting. So now, can the athlete do it at 50%? Okay. Can they do it at 60%? Okay, let's go. So how do we So we use kind of a mastery. Okay, here's the task. Can you do it at 50%? Can you do it at 70%, 80%? Percent of what? Velocity, force, ranges, angles. So we kind of have a parallel system where we have the timeline, but we're also looking at every menu item in the game or in practice, and how close are they back to when they were excellent. So it's kind of predicated that you know what they were like at excellent, or what is the norm for people, you know, in their position at the current state of the game.
And could you, going off that leads perfectly into my next question, which is contingency plans, which is something I absolutely just loved from your thought process. Was, you know, basically like, if this is our goal right here, and like this is the highest priority, so it's as specific as we can get. So like, you know, running 100 meters in the Olympic final is like, every time we get away just one step from that, we're getting less and less specific. But like you kind of make this you know, argument that like rehab like goes from like this to like all the way down there, like we're in a swimming pool doing just nothing, basically detraining everything. And you're like, I want to get as close to that, like get away from that as least as possible when someone's injured. So this idea of contingency plans. So for instance, you gave a great example of like a snatch, and someone goes, I have a shoulder sore, dumbbell snatch. I have a shoulder and a hip that's sore, one leg, one arm, dumbbell snatch. So I just like, you know, this idea of being creative, this, and again, it brings up the concept of creativity and mastery again as a coach, to be able to have that. And probably comes again, as you said earlier, with experience. But can we maybe touch on contingency plans? You know, where, like, when did you kind of come to an appreciation for that?
Well, I think the origins were my first few years in university settings where we had athletic trainers and team docs, and they kind of took control of the athlete when they were injured. And I started noticing when they sent them back to me, they so many things had detrained that it was like almost starting over in a lot of instances on a lot of menu items. So I thought, well, there's got to be a better way to reduce this training gap, or performance gap. And I think the problem that we have now in a lot of sports medicine circles, 872 hours, and have research and methodologies behind their decisions. But returning to World Cup final football match fitness and abilities is a long way from well, I'm in a cast on crutches. There's a few more stages. So we talked about timelines and masteries and landmarks to achieve, and then mastery evolution into the next degree of difficulty or complexity. You know, those are constant drivers. So the chase started like, how do we narrow performance gaps? And as we said earlier, that's the science is, okay, we got to do these menu items. We got to be able to do these tasks. We got to be able to produce these kind of metrics. But the artistry is in like, well, how do we get them back towards there? How are we creative with that? So like with lower leg injuries, you know, do you do a bridge gait workouts that mimic the type of workout that you originally wanted to do on plan A? If not, can you do it on bikes or hand crank or even speed bags? But I think there's a tendency in sports medicine to go back to too global, too general of selection of activities. And then the time frames, you know, they're spending hours in the clinic, and there's only so many hours of resources and battery life in certain systems. And there's a skewedness. So if I have no fast twitch or extreme load on the system for weeks on end in a rehab process, those systems are detraining.
So Dan, something I want to get your thoughts on is cueing. I know you have some opinions on this too. Because currently, you know, I'm on my 5th skill acquisition. I'm actually just finishing Gabby Wolf's book, you know, Attention in Motor Learning. So obviously, you know, there's a big external bias in that. But what are your thoughts on this, you know, concept of external versus internal cueing? And just before you answer that, you gave another great sort of story about like how you were speaking about coordination and like how certain things you do the day of a particular activity. I mean, that could drastically change something you're going to do in your program. And then you spoke about, like, I know we've had this discussion before about like how strength training can like dampen down coordinated factors in the system. And you kind of spoke about this in a lecture. You said that could completely change how I'm going to cue that athlete now the next day from the residual fatigue. So you were just kind of saying like we need to be very cognizant of like how Monday impacts Tuesday and how week one impacts week two and how month one impacts month two and obviously how year one impacts year two, you know, if we're going from the pure micro all the way up to the macro. But just when that's what triggered off this external versus internal cueing question to ask. And you were like, these transient factors could completely change the cue I use that day with that athlete. So what are your thoughts then on external versus internal?
Well, I think probably the first layer is we're really talking about feedback loops. So you get into discussions, mass versus distributive practice and feedback, types of feedback, external cues, internal cues. And I think the research on cueing is relatively young. And I think there's a lot of bias in populations studied, methodologies utilized, practitioners utilized, practitioners' experience with various types of cues, athletes' experience with various types of cues. It's a really hard study to control variables and to delineate variables. And the whole thing in studies, to get it published, we have to delineate to such a degree that the metrics are manageable.
Yeah.
Well, if it's a complex system with layers upon layers upon layers, it almost resists study of those ilks to some degree.
Yeah.
Now, I value the studies. I respect the work of Wolf and our compadres. I never really thought about it that way when I was a younger coach. When I go back and analyze spreadsheets and all of that, I probably use a lot of external cues, but I also use a fair amount of internal cues. And then I found out that if I made a parable or a story, that they consider that an external cue. So, I would say I probably used a third of the time stories and analogies, and now that's external cue. I struggle, like when you get into rhythm dynamics or specific kinesiological errors that you have to change, I guess I'm not clever enough to come up with an external cue that teaches rhythm. But so I think it's a young science. I think it's early days, and I think there's unfortunately a polemic camp battle going on right now, and the external cue guys have a lot more scientists in their camp, so they're winning right now.
The reason why I'm kind of laughing to myself is I remember during my internship, you were with one of the high jumpers, and you were trying to get the point across to her about her penultimate step, and you used a beautiful analogy. You went up and said, "Have you ever seen cow manure slide off a shovel?" And she was kind of like, "Not really." And he goes, "But can you imagine it? Like if you just tilted the shovel and it just smoothly slid off." And she was like, "Yeah, I think I can get it." And he goes, "That's how I want you to hit the ground right before your penultimate." And then she did it, and it was just so funny. So it was. And I remember you turned around and there was a group of us, and you were like, "How many penultimate or like how many high jumps have you guys seen?" And they were all like track and field coaches. And they're like, "Oh, thousands." And I was there. I'm not gonna lie, this is like my 5th ever. I'd just like to get your thoughts now on sort of coaching as a career, and it's a conversation I had recently with Mike Boyle. It's something I speak about an awful lot with a lot of my peers in the field, and the concept of coaching burnout. And I know, like, you yourself, I mean, you've been just like grinding it out for, and I know just Gary Schoenfeld, he hates when people say grinding out, because like, if it's your passion, you should never be grinding. But you get what I'm trying to put across. You've been in the profession now for so long, and you're so well traveled and so much experience. What are your thoughts on coaching burnout? What are your thoughts on trying to avoid it? Can it be avoided if it's like, if coaching is such a vocation and it's what you want to master? Is that just a trade-off you're going to have to make in terms of you're going to have sacrifices that are part of your life? There is going to be unbalance. there is going to be times where energy is going to be drained. Like, what's your whole thought process on kind of the health of the coach?
Well, I'm probably not a great one to talk about it. I've sacrificed health and hit the wall 3 or 4 times in 45 years, and have regrets and have hindsight and 20/20 vision, how to do things maybe a little bit different. I think when you're passionate about a vocation, there's going to be periods where you're super driven and deeply immersed, and you know, there's a lot of variables in life, and you can't juggle 15 balls equally all of the time. So you have to make decisions. You have to do cost benefit analysis on a regular basis. And if your approach to things are causing you to make poor decisions, or there's a lot of conflict in your relationships, to me, that's a red flag. Things are a little bit out of balance. If there's drastic health measures and markers in your life that are failing, obviously that's a red flag. Things are failing. But I struggle to see how a passionate, driven person in sport aren't going to have periods where they're not in balance, or they're pressing their health issues. To me, coaching is an adjunct to training of athletes. We stress athletes with certain overreach or overtraining parameters, overload alarms, overload theory. But I think the key to avoiding extreme burnout is, how do you cycle various stressors, and how do you build in qualitative rest periods and the quality of rest or restoration periods. For me, when I travel, that's a working vacation and it's restorative. If I just shut down and sit on a beach for 3 days, I just collapse. Like, it's too radical of an unload. So I have to have slight undulating unloads. And so travel and auditing and, doing a podcast like this is an hour interruption of emails and meetings. So it's kind of restorative, and it makes me think in different levels or from different angles. So I think rigidity is probably the number one causality of burnout. How rigid are you with all of the activities and thought processes and work schedules and paradigms and biases? And the more rigid I get, the more burnout I get. I know that for sure.
So and the point you bring up there, Dan, about sort of what you remind me of there as you spoke was Mike Robertson, who's a great coach in there's the phone there, in Indianapolis. He spoke about this in his podcast, and he said that, listen, there is going to be times where you're going to be out of balance, just like training, where you functionally overreach. And he's like, his whole thing is, it's okay to be imbalanced in the micro. It's when that becomes the macro. So basically when overreaching becomes overtraining, if we want to put it into athletic preparation terms. So yeah, I completely agree. And I mean, if we just look at everything, if we look at how we look at the lens that we use for training, and took that lens and said, right, look at life through that. It's the exact same. It's stress and adaptation. So it's the exact same in terms of the rhythms and flow. My next question was, it's come back to my mind now. I know you're not a destination or accolade or this is my favorite, this is the best type of guy. I know you're not one of those guys. I've heard you often say that. But you have been and you have coached in so many different places throughout the United States and the world, obviously in London for the 2012 Olympics. You've been to so many Olympic Games. Out of all the programs you've been involved in, even ones you've just been a consultant on, so maybe it wasn't a long-term thing, is there any particular setups that did stand out in your mind where you're like, that was a good time, like that, or even that organization were very close to what I would feel would be, top class performance?
Well, it probably drifts back to my operating philosophy. Things are spectral. So each experience, there's been good moments and there's been bad moments. There's been good people and there's bad people or difficult people. There's been challenges. There's been success, truly a process, embrace the moment kind of guy. So again, not to deflect the question, but it's just not how I think or operate. So every encounter I've had have had incredible moments of euphoria and curiosity and reward, and a lot of dark moments and questioning. And I'm a product of failure, and you fail a million times before you come to a solution. And hopefully I've gotten better at embracing failure and using it as a springboard. But I wouldn't categorize failure being bad and success being awesome, because that's not how I operate.
Yeah, I always use this analogy. It's like, listen, when we were kids and we were learning how to walk and learning how to talk and learning how to cycle, we failed like so many times, and like nobody was like quit. They were just like, keep going, you're gonna get there. Everyone does, because we all do. But then we never.
Or you weren't labeled a failure or mocked for being a failure either. It was like,
absolutely,
next shot, next attempt, you're going to get it. Well, I think it's how we couch failure. And I mean, there's a lot of scientists out there beating the drum for scientific method. Well, let's be honest. A scientific method involves a hypothesis.
Yeah.
And in truth, most scientists are honest. They're going to say they have way more failed hypotheses than successful. And I'm behind some of these guys that are pushing for journals to publish studies that resulted in null hypothesis, or, totally contrary to what they thought was going to happen. Because I think we've brainwashed people into this success paradigm, and just by default, anything that's not successful has a negative connotation.
Yeah. Like I know Carol Dweck has that great book, Mindset and Growth versus Fixed Mindsets. And like, I know we talked about this too when we had dinner in Arizona in Pita Jungle. It was lovely. Thanks for that dinner, by the way, Dan. I remember when we were going for dinner, I was like, Dan, I'm very hungry, so I'm going to order a bit. And you were like, it's okay. And then I ordered, and you're like, you did order a lot. It was like a lot of extra veg and stuff. I was hungry. It was delicious. Thanks for that, by the way. But we spoke about, the way like nowadays it's like everyone has to win. No one has to lose. No one has to go through like any adversity growing up. And what I've really appreciated from someone who's had a huge influence on me, and one of the authors I've had has a huge influence on me, is Alan Watts. So I love a lot of Alan Watts' stuff, and he was like one of the first individuals to make me realize that the universe works in contrast. So he's like, you would not know happiness without sadness. You would not know bliss without some dark periods in your life. You wouldn't know your right without your left. You wouldn't know the daylight without the nighttime. So he's like, it's all necessary. It has to be contrast. So it goes back to this, like, people look at negative as bad. It's like, but you wouldn't know your victories or your positivity without the negativity to contrast it with. So it's all part of the process. And once I came to that realization, it's like, there's no point in worrying about any of it, because it's the whole part of the process.
No, I totally agree. And I think that's probably why I struggle with absolutist and, black and white paradigms. I've said many times, life's spectral, and we bounce around on this spectrum. And the people that are successful over time are the people that surf the spectrum and are at peace with wherever they're at on the spectrum, knowing that it's transient. This too shall pass.
Lincoln.
Yep.
But what would you say had been the or maybe you have? Is there anything over the last 2, 3, 4 years or whatever that you've really changed your mind on? Is there any big thing you've changed your mind on lately?
Well, I change my mind daily and probably hourly.
That's called Alzheimer's, Stan.
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of the big rocks in the philosophical constructs haven't, really changed that much over the past few decades. We're constantly experimenting and looking at things and exploring things. That comes with being curious. I guess probably how I look at therapy and what's in the toolbox and how people select tools to utilize in various therapeutic processes has shifted quite a bit in the last, say, 5 years. And doing a lot more work in return to play. And so how people are looking at and massaging activities and schemes in the latter stages of return to play have probably shifted. I probably had too many gaps in my return to play that I was unaware of that, have since changed.
Cool. What current book or books are you reading right now, and what is your top book recommendation?
Well, again, I don't do favorites or whatnot.
You and your spectrums, damn it.
I'm currently spending a lot of time in historical fiction, 1930s and 40s in Middle Europe.
Fiction?
Yeah, it's historical fiction. So, the big rocks are there. And
yeah.
It's a way for me to explore a time and a place and a thought process that was going on during a very important period in time, I think, for civilization. And I see a lot of parallels to where we're at right now in U.S. politics and where Europe was in the 20s and 30s. So it's, for some reason, I'm attracted to that period, and that's where I'm doing a lot of work.
Did you watch any of those documentaries this end?
Yeah, I'm still piling through it. I'm not a podcast documentary guy, so I have to be in the right place, right time to get through that file, but I'm slowly drifting through the files.
Yeah, big time. Yeah, that was a big time. So the 30s, coming off the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover, and then into FDR, and then fascism in Germany. Because I'd read up a lot of that, and I know that if Dan Pfaff wasn't a track and field coach, he would have been a history teacher.
Yeah, unfortunately, I was discouraged from that. When I was in university, they're like, well, there's a million history teachers and they don't get paid, so don't go into it.
Yeah. That's gas. So Dan, final one for you. Where I'm back in town. Well, it depends on when you are, but let's say we're back in Arizona, and I owe you a meal big time since our last dinner. And I say to you, Dan, you can bring 5 people to this dinner. Now, these people can be dead or alive, so I've got magic powers for the evening. Either that or just some very good smelling salts. But you can bring 5 people to this dinner, dead or alive. Who would you invite to dinner and why?
Well, being a spiritual guy, of course, I'd probably want Jesus in there because I thought he's pretty radical and kind of a rebel. So I'd want to figure out his wheelhouse.
And he looks like one of the Bee Gees.
Yeah. Einstein, obviously.
Cool.
Probably John Wooden, the basketball coach.
Yeah.
Because, I was really intrigued by how he operated. Jean Piaget, a Swiss developmental psychologist.
I knew you'd have Jean Piaget in there.
Yeah, how he came up with things and how he thought of things. And then a guy that I'm really intrigued by was a theologian called Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Germany, World War II.
Brilliant.
And some of his writings really connect with me, and I reread them often. So I'm really attracted to his mindset and his thought train.
Dan, I don't know what to say, man. I say this to Mike Boyle too, because you guys are obviously like father figures to me. So just thanks so much for making time today. But finally, Dan, just for people, and I'll put all this in the show notes. Where can people find out more about you, about Altus? I'll just link them to Altus. Altus.world. I'll link up all the education in terms of Altus 360, the foundation course, and also maybe if you just give a quick update on the essentials course that you guys have coming out.
Yeah, a lot of our work centers out of the Altus program. So if you go online, I think we have a pretty good website that directs people to levels of education, types of courses. The essentials course is our attempt to have a briefer, identify the big rocks, how to apply the big rocks type of course. So it's not as layered or as nuanced as the foundation course. To me, they're totally separate entities. I think it's how deep do you want to dive on certain topics and concepts? Probably the question.
Great. Dan Pfaff, thank you so much. Just 10 seconds before I'll wrap up here. So guys, gotta let Dan go. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks so much for viewing. If you watch this on our YouTube channel, please share this out. If you can leave a review, that really helps get the podcast out there, and we can get even like more legends like Dan on, even though there isn't probably anyone else who's as much a legend as Dan. But so thanks for watching, guys. Take care, and I'll talk to everyone soon.
Thank you.